Ever since I started making Halloween annual specials back in 2019, I have always talked about movies. But my channel name is Kircher Talks Entertainment, dang it. That doesn't mean I have to talk about movies every Halloween, so this year I won't be. Instead, I have something else that has been on my mind lately. A video game entitled Alan Wake. Yes, you could say that me making this video is a tie-in to the long, percolating sequel that just came out a few days ago, and you'd be somewhat correct. It's been my most anticipated game of 2023, aside from Tears of the Kingdom. But more importantly, I wish to express my appreciation for the original Alan Wake for what it did to help me appreciate the horror genre at large. You see, when I was younger, the types of entertainment that were permitted in my household were definitely limited. I didn't really get a chance to start watching PG-13 movies until I was about 10 years old, and R-rated movies were never allowed in my parents' house unless they were edited on TV. Horror movies are typically rated PG-13 and R, so it was very rare that I got to watch one. But even so, I've always been fascinated by scary stories, even at a young age. I'm sure a lot of you watching this video probably read Goosebumps and the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark story collections by Alvin Schwartz, like I did. I loved going to haunted mansions, whether it was someone putting together a DIY house at their own home on Halloween, or the ride at Disneyland. I was equal parts terrified and mesmerized when I heard the campfire tale of the Mogollon Monster at Boy Scout camp. For anyone who doesn't know what that is, it's basically Arizona's version of Bigfoot. And then once I did start watching legitimate horror movies, I developed an early interest with the genre by watching such films as The Watcher in the Woods, Jurassic Park, Poltergeist, Signs, and Wait Until Dark, which was the subject of my 2020 Halloween special. After all of this exposure to spooky stories though, I still had an itch for something that would really captivate me. A story which would satisfy on basic narrative levels, but one that would also keep me on the edge of my seat and affect me long after the credits rolled. Summer 2010 eventually rolled around, and Alan Wake released on the Xbox 360 and PC. My first exposure to the game was at my best friend's cousin's house, where we played the first 2 out of 6 chapters, which are each about the length of a movie. Needless to say, I was transfixed by what I was watching them play. Even with it being light outside, the tension of gameplay taking place primarily at nighttime definitely kept our attentions fixated on the screen. It also helps that the combat hinged on an interesting twist on traditional third-person action. In this game, you can't just shoot your enemies and expect them to die just like that. In Alan Wake, the trick is to use sources of light to quite literally burn away shrouds of darkness from possessed humans known as Taken, and then you can dispatch them with conventional weapons or with some indirect means. Looking back now, having played Alan Wake multiple times over, the least interesting aspect of the game is the gameplay itself. The third-person shooting mechanics are rather rudimentary, the driving is nothing special, and the puzzles are as simple as turning on gas-powered generators or moving something to clear an obstacle. Most of the moment-to-moment gameplay is a means to an end, and if you're looking for something with rather energetic combat, you're better off elsewhere. That's certainly not the main draw of this game. But it's not so much of a negative that it makes the overall experience a chore. Far from it, actually. The core mechanics are functional enough that the basic gameplay is still fun, just not extraordinary. Rather, the context for what you're doing, the atmosphere, and especially the world building, are what make the game stand out even 13 years after its original release, and why it was foundational to my love of the horror genre. The key is that writer Sam Lake and the folks at Finnish studio Remedy Entertainment understood, at the core, what the horror genre is really about. It's not just the thrill of hearing a scary story, or being privy to a narrative that one might consider to be taboo. Horror is truly at its best, and thereby its scariest, when it evokes terrifying imagery and themes to get at the worst aspects of the human experience. Or perhaps, when a work of horror fiction presents a frightening concept that you can't quite wrap your head around.
And you always fear what you don't understand.
Alan Wake, in turn, isn't scary because it features possessed men brandishing weapons like axes and chainsaws, stalking you through the woods. That might be thrilling on a surface level, and I will admit that it made me really weary of the woodlands of northern Arizona when I was a teenager, but after you've gunned down your 100th Taken, the initial fear factor isn't as prevalent. Where the story really earns its fear-inducing reputation, at least for me, boils down to how storytelling melds with gameplay, and moreover how conventions of the horror genre are challenged by the narrative. Before I delve into those specific elements though, allow me to give a quick rundown of what the story is about. Yes, I already touched on the fact that you fight enemies with both light and guns, But there's more to understand than just that. All of this starts with the titular protagonist Alan Wake, a crime thriller novelist who is on a much-needed vacation with his beloved wife Alice in the Pacific Northwest. He has struggled quite severely with writer's block for the past couple years, and unbeknownst to him, Alice had orchestrated the trip specifically to this area so that she could try to convince him to get help from a local psychiatrist who works with artists. After this little secret comes out, a bitter argument ensues, and he storms out of the cabin that they're staying in amidst a surrounding lake. He comes to instantly regret this, though, for shortly after leaving Alice behind, an evil, dark presence kidnaps her, dragging her down beneath the surface of the lake. Alan dives after her, but then the scene immediately cuts to black, with both him and the player being whiplashed forward a week in time. It is here where the aforementioned Taken begin to appear, but more importantly, sheets of paper glistening in the darkness also start materializing.
The loose sheets of paper were pages from a manuscript entitled Departure. That was the name I planned to use for the next novel I had never gotten started. I was named the author. I hadn't written it. I couldn't remember writing it. In the scene on the page, the hero was attacked by an axe murderer in the woods at night.
This choice is absolutely brilliant. When I first experienced the game with my buddies back in 2010, this hook of discovering beats of the story through the manuscript pages fascinated me. Heck, it still does to this day. It helps that whoever wrote these pages did so with effective prose and descriptive wording, because if you find a page describing something that hasn't happened yet, it gives you a fairly good idea of what to expect. Thankfully, the way those events are depicted in the gameplay usually lives up to what is described on the page. There's plenty of suspense that can be gleaned from anticipation of what's to come, while replay value is inherent with finding pages that can only be obtained on a nightmare difficulty playthrough. Those pages usually give further insight into the minds of characters, or provide previously undisclosed background info on the game's universe. All in all, the page mechanic works in the game's favor. It's not only as a meaningful collectible that rewards the player for venturing off the beaten path, but it also makes for an indirect, yet highly effective source of tension for the moment-to-moment gameplay. Just as you, the player, are walking down a defined path set by the developers, Alan is on a journey that he may or may not have direct control over. It's definitely an interesting thought to have as the game progresses and you learn more about why everything happens the way it does. And I suppose that makes now as good a time as any to answer a question you may have had, which is why have these pages suddenly appeared anyway? Well, in order to go into that, I will need to delve into some minor spoilers, but I'm not going to divulge any major twists in the plot. Still, if you'd rather be completely blind to how this story goes, skip to this timecode. Consider this your warning. So do you remember a little bit earlier when I talked about the lake and the dark presence that resides within it? Well, about halfway through the game or so, you learn that the entity feeds off the creations of artists who are in close proximity to the lake. Whether it be a poet writing about his muse, a brother duo of rockers, or a novelist writing a horror story under a trance, the dark presence parasitically gains power from imaginative individuals. What this does is give the developers an excuse to circumvent typical tropes or rules of the horror genre. To be more specific, usually a horror movie establishes certain rules in order for the story to operate under some form of logic. For example, with A Nightmare on Elm Street, it's established that Freddy Krueger invades people's dreams and can kill someone when they're asleep. With Alan Wake, though, this plot device of the dark presence turning Alan's writings into reality basically throws out the need for there to be any rules. Because we understand that every manuscript page foretells something that actually comes to pass, it's easy to believe that anything can and will happen. Creativity like this is what has made me appreciate horror at its best. For the reason most horror movies suck is because they either don't follow their own flimsy rules, or they play up tired cliches that automatically make everything about the story less interesting. I mean, in this game you also get to fight flocks of possessed birds like they're plucked straight from Alfred Hitchcock's movie. You have to run away from a big dark tornado at one point, and you have to use sources of light to burn away a bunch of poltergeist objects like possessed farming equipment. To say that Alan Wake gets a little, crazy is putting things a bit lightly. There's a limit to the insanity that comes as a result of the kooky premise, but there's enough to where the idea of a writer facing the personifications of his twisted imagination feels fleshed out. I won't say too much on this, since I don't want to spoil too much to the point that anyone watching this who hasn't experienced the game would be dissuaded from playing it. Nonetheless, the character of Alan Wake is also an interesting individual to play as, and one that helped me learn what kinds of characters to latch onto in horror fiction. The protagonist in a scary story should harbor a number of different qualities, in which you would expect them to be resourceful, resilient, and proactive in getting themselves out of whatever dire situation they're in. However, you would also expect those same people to be genuinely afraid. That last part is crucial because if the protagonist is full of fear but doesn't buckle under pressure, their survival is easy for the viewer to latch onto. Plus, the audience can then wonder how they would do under similar circumstances. Alan Wake fits the bill with all of these different criteria. He reacts realistically to his circumstances, pushes through all of his adversities in order to save Alice. His desire to overcome character flaws makes him relatable, and it also helps that much of the story is framed through Alan narrating what he's experiencing.
As a teenager, just starting to get interested in writing, Stephen King had been a source of inspiration to me. I thought about all the inanimate objects that had come to life in his books. No one is safe in a good horror story, certainly not the protagonist. That's what makes them fun. This was anything but. The darkness could possess anything, and it was getting closer.
Normally I'm not too keen on voiceover narration, but it works here both due to the excellent vocal performance by Matthew Peretta and the fact that it's written as though Alan is expressing his thoughts in the same way he'd compose a novel. There's a richness to his spoken narration that adds flavor to the imagery we're witnessing just as he experiences it. Ultimately, the creative team did well to have this character be an effective lens through which the player can experience the story. For me, being a teenager with a budding interest in horror, this was the perfect touchstone I needed to really start loving this genre. And at the end of the day, that was really my objective in reappraising Alan Wake in the way that I did. Rather than doing some unfocused deep dive, I wanted to express that this game deserves greater appreciation for how it celebrates the horror genre at its best. It's not a perfect game by any means, but what it does to play around with the conventions of the genre, deconstruct them, and then go hog wild on pulling together a supernatural thrill ride is nothing short of a blast. Plus, it's really easy to come back to this game over and over again. The story is layered enough to where one would pick up on new details each playthrough. The episodic format makes the experience very digestible across its roughly 10-hour length, and horror fans can appreciate how much this game pays loving homage to other stories, particularly those by Stephen King. Even if you don't really care for video games, because I know some of you watching this don't, give this game a shot. You may find that it will help increase your love for horror, just as it did for me at a young age, and continues to do so now. And that's it! Thank you for checking out what I had to say about what I consider to be a bona fide cult classic of both video games and horror fiction in general. If you liked what you saw and would be eager to see more of what I have to offer, please consider subscribing to the channel and joining the notification squadron so that you won't miss out on my future videos. And of course, if you are interested in Alan Wake, you can pick up the remastered version on PlayStation, Xbox, and the Epic Games Store. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a safe and happy Halloween.